Good morning, everyone. A quick statement regarding this matter that you're all here for. Recently, the Winnipeg Police Service was notified by justice officials that they had reached a resolution agreement respecting charges laid against Mr. Shawn Lamb. From a Winnipeg police perspective, this was a difficult and challenging case that resulted in all discovered evidence being forwarded to Manitoba Justice. Now, the Winnipeg Police Service acknowledges the efforts that justice officials have made to evaluate the evidence, prepare a prosecution, and ultimately reach a defined result, in this case, convictions of manslaughter. The service further acknowledges the difficult decision to forego a criminal trial. We accept this fact and respect the authority by which this decision was made, recognizing the decision balances the interests of justice with public safety concerns. Mr. Lamb came into police custody during a sexual assault investigation that was unrelated to the homicides of Carolyn Sinclair and Lorna Blacksmith. While being processed for the sexual assault, Mr. Lamb indicated he knew where a body was. This statement triggered a homicide investigation. The body of Carolyn Sinclair was discovered. However, Mr. Lamb was not cooperative with police and did not provide a formal statement to police at that time. After being remanded into custody at the Provincial Remand Centre, investigators were contacted by Mr. Lamb. He indicated that he had more information to relate about the homicide and the other crimes that he had committed. He was willing to cooperate, but requested police assist him with canteen privileges at the remand center before he would agree to being interviewed. Investigators considered his request and consulted with prosecutors who gave specific advice on how to proceed with an interview in those circumstances. This was done before agreeing to establish a $600 canteen fund for Mr. Lamb at the Provincial Remand Centre. During an interview with homicide investigators, Mr. Lamb voluntarily outlined his involvement in the homicides of Carolyn Sinclair and Lorna Blacksmith. A formal statement was obtained and charges were authorized by provincial prosecutors. Now, after the initial statement was secured, Mr. Lamb continued to contact investigators, indicating he would provide more information about other homicides that he was involved in. Again, he requested canteen funds before agreeing to be interviewed. 2 subsequent interviews were conducted with Mr. Lamb. Neither of the interviews provided investigators with any additional evidence. An additional $900 was deposited into his canteen fund at the Provincial Remand Centre. To sum up, after consulting with prosecutors, a decision was made to provide Mr. Lamb with canteen funds so that he would agree to be interviewed. The interview resulted in information that led to formal charges against Mr. Lamb that were authorized by prosecutors. This brought closure to the families of Carolyn Sinclair and Lorna Blacksmith. It was hoped subsequent information would be forthcoming to bring closure to the families of other victims that Mr. Lamb may have been involved in. The Winnipeg Police Service is sensitive to the fact that there are many missing and murdered women in Manitoba and Canada. These investigations are a priority for us. In this case, the investigators explored all available options in the interests of justice and public safety.
How much money in total was deposited in his account?
In total, $1,500.
And that was in 2 different, so the first was the 600 and then the second was the 900?
Actually, it was done in 3 separate deposits.
Of how much each?
6, 6, and 3.
And what was the second 6 and 3 for? Was there like specific information that it paid for?
I'm not aware. This was to agree to be interviewed.
How do you feel about people, or Mark Glazer specifically, alleging that police paid for the confession.
I wasn't there, I didn't hear the comments in their context. Certainly, I didn't agree with exactly how he put it.
But did police pay for information or did police pay for a confession?
I would say, we agreed to pay so that we could have access to Mr. Lamb. That was the only way he would agree to be interviewed.
So it was for the interviews, really?
Yes.
Okay.
How unusual is that move?
I would say that's very unusual. In my time, that's the first time I can recall us going to that kind of a measure.
And why did you feel you needed to? He just wasn't, you thought you wouldn't get the answers if you didn't?
He certainly wasn't and hadn't cooperated up until that point.
But police already had him pegged as a suspect, I thought, in the Carolyn Sinclair.
Well, the only way I can answer that, having someone as a suspect and having evidence against them is two different things.
I suspect this must have posed some ethical questions for you. What kind of discussions went on within the department when you were considering this?
Certainly, there were a lot of consultations that occurred prior to us taking action.
What were some of the concerns?
I guess the first and foremost, payment would be looked upon as an inducement, and that would be really what we were collaborating with the Crown.
And did the Crown agree that that is what it would look like?
Certainly, they provided us with specific advice on how we would proceed with an interview.
Did Lamb sign any documentation indicating his understanding of what this money was being paid to him for and what the expectations were of him?
I don't know the answer to that.
Did you expect to get a confession when you paid him this money?
Certainly, we expected to have an interview with him. I don't know if the investigators knew where it would go.
And just to double check on the timeline, the initial $600 was paid before he made any comments whatsoever implicating himself. The additional $900 was paid after he had indicated that he had involvement in these homicides?
Sort of to clarify, he had told investigators while he was being processed for a sexual assault that he knew where a body was.
But not necessarily by his own hands.
So
But that was the $600, but then was that additional $900
No,
paid?
he was, he was processed and remanded into custody. Again, we had been investigating a sexual assault charge. He reached out to investigators afterwards. But you're right, the $600 was paid before he agreed to be, paid to his canteen fund before he agreed to be interviewed.
But I guess just to simplify, I'm asking, was any of that $1,500 paid to him after he had implicated himself, confessed?
Yes. We had 3 interviews with him in total. $600 was paid before the first one. Subsequently, there were 2 interviews afterwards.
Was there a discussion about stopping payments at that point? The initial payment could have been treated more as paying an informant without knowing that he was involved, just paying for information he had. But once he had implicated himself, was there discussion about not giving him any further money because now that could really look like it's paying for a confession?
Certainly that was considered. Certainly we're also trying to consider the fact that he may actually have been involved in other things that he was willing to share.
Was it worth it? Do you think the payment, was it worth it?
I think, I don't really know how to answer that. For the families of the people that were involved in this, I think it certainly brings some closure to them knowing what occurred and that there's been some justice here. These were difficult decisions.
What do you
What's the
think?
time
For people
frame?
who don't know, what are canteen privileges, for people who have no knowledge at all of that?
Well, to be honest, I haven't been in the remand center before, so I don't really know how that works either. But what I would understand is that prisoners that are in custody there have a fund set up so they have access to telephone privileges, canteen privilege, typical canteen things that you might acquire. And of course, there's no money in prison, in institutions, so it would be done on a fund.
Are we talking about days, weeks, or months that the 3 interviews and the 3 payments were deposited?
You know, that one I'm not certain of, to recall.
Was within, I believe within a 30-day period would be my understanding.
And when was this?
Shortly after the sexual assault arrest,
Which would have been
almost 2 years ago.
June? Was it June last year, or June 2 years ago, or is that
I think it was even earlier than
May?
that.
What was Winnipeg's police position if you didn't give the money? Did you think,
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking.
because what we heard in court yesterday, there was no evidence, no forensic evidence, no witnesses. Did police feel that this was their only option to try and get any information?
Well, really, to put that even into greater context, we wouldn't even have known what people he was talking about had he not agreed, we wouldn't have known even where to look for additional evidence had he not outlined his involvement.
What's your response, say Winnipeg Police paid for these types of things? So what do you say to that? So Winnipeg Police paid for this confession, Winnipeg Police will pay a killer for information. What do you say to that? That's the public's perception now.
You know, this is an extraordinary measure that we considered on this one, and I think, put in the context of missing and murdered women and the sensitivity around that and trying to get to the bottom of some of those things, I think every case would be weighed individually. This wouldn't be something we would do routinely. Certainly in this case, and it's the first time in my knowledge that we've entered into this kind of tactic, but, it was, we were prepared to take an extraordinary measure in this case.
Is this
Do you
something
think-
you'll do again? You'll consider doing again?
That would be a difficult question to answer. I think every case has to be looked at in its own merits.
Do you think there's more information on other women who disappeared that Shawn Lamb may have? Has he told you that, oh, I know where so-and-so is, or is there any more dealings that you are having with him and any possible news?
I don't think we would ever close the door on anything when information comes forward. Certainly, the two subsequent interviews that we had were not fruitful, and no further discussions occurred with them.
Was it, and this may be obvious, you mentioned you consulted with senior justice officials and they sort of outlined, I guess, a process or protocol. Safe to say, did police follow that to the letter? You didn't deviate at all from what instructions you were given in terms of how to handle this?
Yes.
And was it told to you at the time that this possibly could come back to bite everyone in the way that it was brought forward yesterday in court, with lawyers saying, had this gone to trial, these statements, I think the term was very likely, would have been excluded and we wouldn't have had a case? Was that something you were kind of cognizant of?
No, I wasn't aware of any specific discussions like that.
But is that something you would have been made aware of in your consultations with the Crown? Is that something that they had said, this is a possibility in the future when it does go to trial, that these video statements may not?
Certainly at that point, we would have been at the front end of our investigation. Clearly, investigators would hope that we would discover other evidence that would corroborate the statement. In this case, that didn't occur.
We can take one more question. Go ahead.
Without this confession, what case did Winnipeg Police really have on this guy?
In this particular case, ultimately it came down to being a statement case. Any case, whether it's this one or any other case that relies on a statement case, the Crown would take the time to weigh that statement, before it determined what to do. And that's not specific to a case like this.
Sorry, just a clarification. You mentioned these were interviews. What was the difference between an interview and a confession?
Well, we don't really use terms like confession. In an interview, we record an interview. A formal statement is, a video recording of that interview, in essence, becomes a statement. We refer to it as a statement. Within that statement, certainly he made some confessions.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Sorry for the short notice.